This is the continuation of a series of lectures for Political Science 101 Principles of Political Science. This lecture will cover chapters 2 and 3. Much of chapter 2 has already been touched upon in previous lectures, but there are just one or two things that I'd like to go over in order to make the theory hopefully a little bit clearer. Okay. Fundamental law and the diffusion of authority were incompatible with political modernization. Modernization requires authority for change. Fundamental in society and politics come from the purposeful actions of men, hence authority must reside in men, not in unchanging law. So fundamental law and this authority, diffusion of authority, were incompatible because political modernization requires to have authority for change, but that authority has to reside in people, not just in unchanging law, which simply means that you have to have the ability to adapt. That authority must be in place in order to make the changes that are necessary to accommodate modernization. Now, in Europe, we already talked about, they had a relatively straightforward move forward from about 476 to 1450. The medieval and Tudor societies had different functions, and they did not advance. America, sovereignty was divided, power was separated, function combined in many different institutions, and you had a fusion of function and a division of power. In Europe, you had differentiation of functions and a centralization of power. So the major difference here is a centralization of power versus a division of power. Every time you centralize power, you run the risk of having minimum solutions to more and more increasingly complex problems. So America was really the first to achieve a wide level of political participation. And the rationale there is pretty simple. Society was based on that. There was no king, there was no queen. In fact, the movement away from those things was what was sort of the driving force. So you have this separated power, divided power. You have different institutions in America. And there is no centralization of power, but a centralization of functions. So when you look at these things, you begin to compare Europe and America. There was an opposition in Europe to modernization, which is understandable. There were old forms of government, and there was power that was already in the hands of certain people, and once you have power, you're not readily willing to let that go, obviously. So you can't really have a modern society with outdated political structures. And so that has to change. Aristocracy has to yield at some point to a much broader and more inclusive system. And as you look around the world in Asia and South America and other places, they all have, in one way or another, run into difficulties that we find during the modernization process, which is coping. Because in order to cope successfully with modernization, political systems have to, if you recall, innovate policy, promote social and economic reform, assimilate new social forces, and achieve a new social consciousness. So just taking a look at that a little bit more closely, innovating policy is a function of solving issues. Times change, people change, structures need to change, and policies have to be thought up or innovated in order to meet those challenges. Now, one of the major difficulties here is promoting social and economic reform. Because in order to do that, you have to change values and behavior. And that's no easy road to traverse. Changing values and behavior means that you've got to do this incredibly difficult task in a reasonably short period of time, because modernization, especially on the social and economic fronts, sort of moves forward at a rather fast pace if it's going to move. So you have to be able to expand communications and education, broaden loyalties from the family to the village, and the village to the tribe, to the nation. Broaden loyalties from family, village, or tribe to the nation. Secularize, rationalize authority, promote functionality, and so on. Now, we talked about this before, but here are two key things that must happen. The assimilation of new social forces is absolutely critical, because those new social forces bring with them new problems and new difficulties, and they're going to put a further stress on the political institutions. And so, if we're talking about expanding, and moving forward, it means an expansion and diversification of social forces, and it also means that the political institutions are going to grow more structured, more diverse, and there'll be a diffusion of responsibility. All right. So, what happens is a new social consciousness begins to develop. When you think about it, as things change, people become aware of things that are new, but also they view things that are old ideas and concepts and relationships differently. Human nature is going to undergo change. If it undergoes change, then social functions and forces come forward, and political institutions have to meet those demands within that structure. So if that doesn't occur, the system will stop. In other words, the process will have to stop. So the multiplication and diversification of social forces creates a demand on the political institutions that have to be ready and able to deal with those. Bringing in those new social forces is absolutely critical, but at the same time, it places a greater burden, greater stress on the political institutions, because stability is the relationship between those two things. It's based on their functions. So keep in mind throughout this whole process, the key thing is those social forces. Think of the social forces as fabric. The more diverse they are, the stronger the fabric, provided that that fabric is structured or stretched over these political institutions that can support it. So at the end of the day, you can increase your social forces, but without an adequate increase or structuring of the political institutions, you're going to have a breakdown. If it works in the other direction, where you have stagnant social forces but an ever complex political institutional structure, it kind of grinds to a halt, right? So let's take a look at how states innovate policy in order to meet this ongoing increasing number and rate of social forces. So the first we talked about was innovations and encouragement, in the distribution and the concentration of power. In other words, states innovate policy because those policies are encouraged by what? A power distribution. And it can't be highly concentrated nor too widely dispersed. So you have a real issue here. You have to innovate policy, but power distribution leads to an easier time doing that. Highly concentrated, and it's problematic. But if it's too widely dispersed, if power is too widely dispersed, then that becomes problematic. So it's a very fine balance where, in terms of power being distributed. Highly concentrated, not good. Too widely dispersed, not good. Somewhere between those is where we want to be. So if you look at the rate of innovative proposals, which is what we want, that's proportional directly to the diversity of an organization. More diversity, more proposals for innovating policy. Think about in a political institution or any institution where there's just one person. How many innovative ways can they come up with resolving problems? They may be very good at it, and they may come up with a bunch, but it's going to be limited in number. So the more diverse the organization, the more voices there are, the more innovative policies they're going to come up with. So they're going to propose more innovation. So if we have an organization that is more diverse, we're going to get more proposals. So innovative proposals are important, but the other side of this is the rate of adoption of those proposals. Obviously, to have a lot of great ideas, but none of them get implemented is a problem. or to have one idea and not have it implemented as a problem. So the implementation end of this, or adopting the proposals of policies, is important. Unfortunately, this relationship is inversely related. The more diverse an organization is, the rate of adoption is slower. In other words, the more people that are involved with coming up with innovative ideas, it takes them longer to adopt any one policy. In other words, there's a lot of people that have a say, lots of ideas floating around, much more difficult to implement them. And the alternative, very few proposals, not much diversity, right? But you can adopt them pretty quickly. So the more people you have involved in the process, the policy process, the problem-solving process, that's good. But then when you go to adopt a proposal, it's problematic. Think of the U.S. Congress. You got a lot of voices. Plus, you've got governors and mayors and the executive branch and the judicial branch and the public. You've got a lot of people, with a lot of input. And so you have a lot of ideas out there, which is great. But when you go to actually implement them, it becomes really problematic. Now, it shouldn't be as problematic as, in the case of the Congress of the United States, where they can't seem to get anything done. But there's more to it than just a number of innovative policies that are presented. It has to do with political parties and the struggle for political power, but we'll get to that later on. So if the power is dispersed, you're going to get many proposals, but few adoptions. If it's concentrated, say in a dictator or the like, you'll get few proposals, but many adoptions, right? So modernization requires less innovation, right, and more adoption of policies. In other words, there's a point of diminishing returns. Idea after idea after idea, at some point, a determination has to be made. So even though you'll have more and more innovative policy suggestions, at some point you have to begin to slow that process down, or you're going to have to figure out a way to get some things resolved, or you're not going to be able to move forward at all. So modernization, as we know, is associated with a redistribution of power, right? You get the breakdown of local, religious, and other power centers, and the centralization of power begins to break down, and you get the assimilation of new groups, and you get a re-expansion of power. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that as you modernize, those old power structures begin to break apart, right? And the centralization of power begins to break apart. And the assimilation of new social groups, right, begins to occur because there's more freedom, and you get an expansion of power. Now, that's important. As you'll see with Dahl later on, power is critical to the process. It always has been, always will be. So when we look at power, we can say that it can be expanded or contracted, and concentrated or dispersed. So let me explain that relationship. You can expand power or contract it. That means the number of people, right? You can expand power to a greater number, or you contract it to fewer people, right? And we can have it be concentrated or dispersed, right? So power can either be, residing in fewer people that have a greater say, or dispersed amongst many that have less of a say. So expanded or contracted, concentrated or dispersed. That's what we're really looking at, right? You can expand it or contract it. You can concentrate it or disperse it, okay? So what this means is you can concentrate it, is on the one hand, you're talking about the amount of power that resides, say, in one individual or one piece of the bureaucracy, or you can disperse it over many different parts of the bureaucracy. Either way, the way in which power is utilized by the many is what's important here. So here's another way to think of this. You could have fewer political institutions, right, that have a lot of power. You can have a few political institutions that have very little power, right? Like think of a dictatorship. Or you can have more of a democracy, where you're going to have power be dispersed, and it's not necessarily going to be, concentrated in the hands of the few. What's key here is this, that the concentration of power, the expansion of power, the dispersion of power, all of this means that during the process of modernization, right, that you need one of these things to happen: a concentration of power, expansion of power, the dispersion of power. Something has to happen to the power structure that exists, right? So political systems differ then in the amount, the distribution, and the capacities for concentrating or expanding power. Can you give power to more people? How much do you give? What's the distribution of that? What percentage do these people or this organization get? In the United States, for example, we have checks and balances, and so the amount of power presumably is equal amongst the branches, or at least in the way that they can check each other. So it's important to understand that power, as it exists in whatever system, is going to go under some sort of changes. In other words, it's going to reform itself. It's going to have to restructure. If you look at, for example, in a Praetorian society, there's a lack of effective institutions, right? Those things are not there. So to have a lack of institutions means that the relationship between the social forces and political institutions is disrupted in a way that's critical, in a way that's going to keep the society from moving forward. In a single-party system, you have a concentration of power, right? And the innovations and assimilation of these things might be greater, but the policy options and the creativity of those policy options is relatively small. In multi-party systems, you have a great capacity for expanding and assimilating, but you're less capable of, concentrating that power and getting things done. So what you need to get from all this is something very simple. Political institutions need to be able to deal with an ever-increasing number of complex problems. And in order to do that, you have to specialize and separate those institutions, break them up, and give them enough power to deal with their issue. And that means concentrating the power in that particular area to that particular group. So even though power is dispersed among many pieces of the bureaucracy, but then in any given piece of that bureaucracy, the power to deal with the issues related to that piece of the bureaucracy is concentrated. In other words, you got to give people responsibility and their job to do, but you got to give them power to get that done. So you can disperse it, but you got to concentrate it. All these different pieces of bureaucracy have power. You've dispersed it, but on a given issue, within a given structure, you're going to have to centralize that power within that each group. So think about the presidency. If the president were not able to get anything done because the president had no power, then there's no point in having that structure, that system. In other words, there may be certain powers that are concentrated in the president. For example, the United States, breaking a treaty, let's say, although we can have a discussion about whether or not the president has the authority to do that, but the president breaks a treaty. Well, that power really could reside in the executive branch. We know making a treaty doesn't, that according to the Constitution, you need the advice and consent of the Senate. So obviously, there's a division of labor, if you will, but there's a reliance upon other parts of the bureaucracy to get the job done in certain areas. Think of the Congress. The way the Congress works is they work on a committee basis. The chambers are broken down into particular policy areas, and those committees and their subcommittees meet based on the issues that need to be addressed, and those issues, where they reside within the structure. So if someone is on the Armed Services Committee, they're going to be dealing with things that are relevant to the armed services. So in that area, power has been dispersed to many different committees, but it's concentrated in one particular committee that deals with that issue. That's a pretty healthy structure, at least on the face of it, without going into the corruption that happens or those sorts of problems. Fundamentally, what we've done is we've gone ahead and we've broken all that up, and we've allowed people to get their job done based on their policy area, based on the structure. So if you look at power traditionally, it's really fallen into two groups. If you look at the feudal state, right, where you have small social groups and they're pretty self-sufficient, right, and executive functions as we think of them, are exercised by the same individuals. That's a feudal state, and that's how power is sort of structured. Or the bureaucratic state, where there is central power, right, but it's broken up based upon the policy areas. Okay, so the key elements then are this concentration or dispersion of power. So if you compare the two, in a feudal state, and you compare that to a bureaucratic state, you can see that they are structured differently and they move differently. Now, we're not here to make a determination about which is best in terms of anything other than which of the two structures are more likely to facilitate this idea of modernization, because we've already come to accept that that's the goal here, right? So if you can't progress, if you can't change, then you're not going to be able to move forward. This is the danger with power. When power resides in the few, those few hold on to it so tightly that you really can't have the kind of dispersion of power and the granting of responsibility to others for fear that they'll get power. And so you've got a very few set of elites that are trying to accommodate, deal with, structure more and more complex issues in order to keep the citizenry, if you will, from rising up. So keep in mind here that you got to be able to come up with policy innovations, right? And you got to be able to reform the way you're doing things. If you can't reform the way in which power is used and policy demands and so on are met, then the society is not going to last very long during the process. In other words, you just can't have a small group moving people forward through the process of modernization. That's not going to work. So, and even how you gain legitimacy, under that situation, right? It's not going to happen. So, you can look at, for example, a monarchy, right? And you can look at a democracy, and you can see that the structures of those two things are different, and that in the first instance, you're relying on relatively few, which is the case in any traditional society, right, to resolve issues and move the nation forward. But that's very different, right, and very difficult to do for each of them. So if you look at that first stage of modernization, who are the prime movers and shakers? The monarchy, the church, the aristocracy, the army, or the bureaucracy, which is not, those are not likely to move things forward, given, especially at a fast pace, given that so much power resides with each of them, right? So you have, as modernization proceeds, you have new groups emerging, as we've talked about, right? And those new groups are going to place new pressures. And those pressures are going to question the authority of the monarchy, the church, the aristocracy, the army, the bureaucracy. It's going to challenge it, right? And as modernization proceeds, these new social forces, there are certain groupings of these social forces that not only emerge, but become a direct challenge to the authority that exists. So, these new groups that emerge, to name a few, are the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia, the people that start thinking about these things beyond the social structure as it exists. Your philosophers, your those that are educated in the ways of the world, that that group begins to think about things the way they are and the way they might or ought to be. Then you've got a commercial entrepreneurial structure that begins to take place with entrepreneurs. And they question the structure of things in a more practical way, which is, why is power diffused this way, and why is it interfering with my ability to acquire wealth for myself? And eventually, you're going to have, the urban working class, and that may develop, and eventually the peasantry, which has always existed sort of outside the political realm, but they're going to become more politically aware and active when they realize that sort of the cards are stacked against them. So as modernization moves forward, you get these groupings that are very critical because they challenge or begin to challenge the power structure as it exists, right? Least likely to move forward out of this is the peasantry, because they are outside the political realm, and they take a while to become aware of the game that is afoot. Whereas the intelligentsia, they have the wherewithal to be able to understand what's going on. The commercial entrepreneurial group, they have a vested interest in seeing that power rearranged so that they can benefit from it. The professional and managerial types, they also see that their future lies in their ability to create wealth for themselves, but within an organization. So you've got that whole structure there. You've got those people that are in the intelligentsia, the commercial entrepreneurial folks, the professional and managerial types, and then pretty soon it's the urban working class and the peasantry, and this becomes politically difficult because each of these in some way is going to challenge the traditional authority of the prime movers in those early stages of modernization. When you think about the religious authorities, the landowners, the military, and the bureaucracies, they're everywhere in that first stage of modernization, right? They're preeminent. The success of the monarchy depends in large part on the extent to which the monarchy can win the support, right, of the people. So when you think about it, if you think about England, the transition from a monarchy to its present form of government, where the monarchy is still in place but has managed to transform itself into something very different than what monarchies have been in the past, you see that it's possible for the old traditional ways to succeed or continue so long as they adapt and so long as they embrace the changes that are being made and, of course, are willing to give up some of their power or authority. If they're not willing to do that, then it's very difficult for them to continue on as a society modernizes. Their power is being challenged. They can give it over or give some of it over and find a place for themselves, or they can fight that, try and suppress it, and run the risk of losing everything. So if you think about this, we come to sort of this classic dilemma in that first phase of political modernization, right? You get traditional pluralism confronting modernizing despotism, and liberty is pitted against equality. So what this means is that as you have these power structures, right, and as we modernize, you've got to have a transformation, right, from those few that control the society to more people, and in the more people that will then have or share that power in a modernizing society. But here again, you've got to be very careful because the contest between these elements can lead to all kinds of possible outcomes other than moving further down, towards a modernized society. And the reasoning is very simple. As we said before, what you have a need to reform the way things are, right? Move them from the traditional to the modern. But as you do that, so much has to be transformed that you can actually, and at a reasonable speed, you can cause so much disturbance to the structure as it exists that people become stressed out. The social forces become restless. And it can lead, doesn't have to, but can lead to, revolution. And the problem with revolution, as you'll see when we get to it, is that revolution